Thank you, Mr. Gandhi. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to Professor Kumar for joining us. It's indeed a rare privilege for me because I've read and observed Professor Kumar's work in multiple, medium on the internet. I've seen some videos. I've dialed into some calls, and I'm always struck by both the clarity and the kind of connect with the real people's lives, which is often the kind of accusation against economists that we live. I wouldn't call myself one, but those who are professional economists live a bit in the theoretical world. So, contrary to that, I'm always struck by how Professor Kumar's comments reflect what we as politicians see on the ground in the lives of common people. A little while ago, maybe a couple, 2-3 years ago, a personal friend of mine, though we have a huge ideological difference, Mr. Gurumurthy, made some kind of comment about Indian economics, that there was such a thing as a unique field of economics that was suited for India, and that the thoughts of great thinkers, over the decades and over the centuries, from Adam Smith through to Keynes and Friedman, somehow didn't apply to India. Of course, it's a bit of a joke. Of course, at some level, the principles and the fundamentals are the same anywhere you go. At some other level, the unique structure of each society's pyramid, the psychology of the participants, the nature of a rationality or irrationality varies. And to that extent, of course, you need to base the application of those principles to the domain that you're studying. And there's no way that one can argue that the general principles of economics, or for that matter, the regulations around banking finance like Basel, somehow shouldn't apply to India. I think that's just kind of off the base. So with that as background, I say that I'm uniquely privileged today to be on this panel with Dr. Kumar. As a politician and as a former banker, trader, global head of various fixed income and then reasonable parts, equity, volatility, and prime brokerage and structuring kind of activities, I wouldn't call myself an economist. I'm much more a market kind of observer, participant, and somebody who thinks like bankers and market participants do. But in my new role as a MLA, I would say that what I think a budget is supposed to embody is two distinct things. One, a clear state of where the finances of the country, or in the case of Tamil Nadu, the state are. Where do we stand? What does our balance sheet look like? What does our cash flow statement look like? What does our deficit look like? What does our service cost look like? And how does that compare to last year? And how is it going to progress in the next year? And secondly, as a statement of intent, what are the government's priorities? How much weight do we give to kind of what segment of society? How much to the supply side? How much to the demand side? How much to which sector? How much to kind of overall fiscal prudence, etc. And if that is the basis, and as a person who has initiated the debate in the Tamil Nadu Assembly on the budget for the last 4 or 5 years, I have to say that the quality of the budgets presented, both at the state level and the central level, have been deteriorating rapidly over the last few years. From a state of the state, where are we perspective, the numbers are increasingly bad. Some of it is by design. As a member of the Public Accounts Committee for 5 years and somebody who has worked extensively with the Auditor General and the Accountant General of Tamil Nadu, I find that the likelihood that the numbers are firmed up in a reasonable manner 30 days after the month is over is pretty close to zero. So if you have a budget presented on February 1st and going to print by about January 15th or 20th, realistically, the numbers you have even for December 31st are kind of vague guesses at best. And this is despite the fact that the government of India does, of all things, I don't know why, cash accounting. I mean, as an ex-market participant and a guy who studied accounting for several years and seen what kinds of things can be done with accounting, good and bad, I'm surprised that we still do cash accounting and not accrual accounting, which even the smallest firm listing on any exchange will have to do. But even on cash accounting, the government of India, the government of Tamil Nadu is not able to produce its numbers in a reasonable time frame. The government of Tamil Nadu's final accounts if we are lucky, will come available on September 30th for the year ended March 31st. So you can guess the quality of the numbers that go into the budget, and moving the budget forward to February 1st, in my opinion, has deteriorated the likelihood of the numbers in the revised estimate matching the final account with any kind of reliability. But also, I think the numbers are bad by intent, because this government does a lot of ad hoc and kind of funny money accounting. What has happened, for example, for 2-3 years in the Food Corporation of India's borrowings, and then has been brought back into the balance sheet of the government itself, into the debt load of the government itself. These kinds of activities further make the numbers unreliable and obfuscated. And then you go to what is the government's intent? Again, a good government would try and put as much of it in either the president's address or the budget in terms of what the legislative agenda for the year is going to be. But if you look at the last 5 years, the government's major decisions, from demonetization to a rapid implementation of GST to making statements about what the Finance Commission should do and its terms of reference, and the notion of a separate levy and cess for defense and all these things. These are major policy decisions that affect both the union government as well as the states, who are, in the nature of our democracy, kind of second-class citizens economically to the central government. And all of these decisions get taken ad hoc, by grand intent and by grand design, kind of leader who has this kind of proclivity to make big announcemements. And so the budget itself becomes kind of a meaningless document or a meaningless exercise. Certainly the intent expressed in the budget and what happens in the next 12 months vary widely. Within these kinds of deteriorating conditions, it is still a budget, it is still a constitutional democracy. We still have to read something into it. So I would read it at a more macro level as a market participant, and what I think I take away from the role of the government, the nature of its priorities and so forth. And the first thing that strikes me is that this government is increasingly losing control of its finances. Its revenues as a percentage of GDP have been declining, though not as rapidly as the state of Tamil Nadu, for example, which has lost 1/3, gone from 10.5% of GSDP to 7% of GSDP. The government of India has declined by 1.5%, 2%, depending on which kind of accounting format you take. The second is that they are completely dependent on indirect taxes. The ratio of indirect to direct taxes has skewed so greatly towards the poor and the common man, and so much of it is coming out of petrol and diesel and cesses, that it is almost immoral, in my opinion, how much the corporates and the upper tax earners are getting breaks relative to the common man, who is taxed indirectly, regressively, without any control of their outcomes through point of sale taxes. It is also very clear that this government is much more skewed philosophically to the supply side than the demand side. Long before we started talking about the demand slowdown, let's say a year and a half ago, long before the full effects of demonetization were known. I mean, some people predicted it, Professor Kumar being a very clear example. But the full impact of the disruption of something like demonetization was not realized, at least in official statistics, for a long time. But long before that became apparent, the government was very much a supply-side government and was continuously giving tax breaks and kind of incentives for industrialists and investments and corporates and rich people, which, even in the best of circumstances in places like the US, have a mixed kind of history of achievement. Whether Reagan-esque kind of trickle-down and supply-side work or not is still a debate. Certainly, in a poor country like India, in a developing country like India, there is no kind of example or prior data that suggests that these things work really well. In that sense, it is shocking to see that a government that has been till now skewed towards the supply side further scale back on the demand while we are going through the worst crisis, in terms of lockdown, at least in our lifetimes. So the cut to the MNREGA, after you take away all the funny money accounting, the cuts in the subsidies, the cutback in the education budget and so forth, it is very clear that this budget continues to disregard the fact that we have the worst demand shortfall in decades, if not since the independence, and that the government's actions seem very kind of contrary to that understanding. In terms of its policies, the two major policies that they keep talking about are both, to me, contradicted by their actions. They keep talking about disinvestment as a way of bridging this gap. Now, one could argue about the merit of disinvestment and the kind of implications of competence that it brings if you have to rely on large-scale disinvestment as a way of bridging the budget gap. But irrespective of that, they are either ingenious at best or with malintent at worst. When they say that the budget for disinvestment last year was 1.5 lakh crore, and while the world was pumped full of liquidity and every market was soaring and every asset was at like record levels, the government did not take any step, any action to do disinvestment. Now they come back and say, no, we're going to do 2 lakh or 1.75 lakh crore. So is it that they are incompetent? Is it that they say they're going to do something, but then they have second thoughts? Is it that they are waiting for these entities to be driven down in value through kind of malfeasance and backdoor accounting and stripping of dividends and so forth before that they start selling it, and then they will do insider dealing to their donors of the anonymous bonds, electoral bonds? It's hard to say. And the second kind of glaring contrast is the Atmanirbhar philosophy. On the one hand, they say Atmanirbhar. On the other hand, they say FDI. And of all places, the single biggest shortfall, as an ex-market participant, in my understanding of the world, the single biggest financial problem we have in India is that we don't have a market for long-term debt. Banks are the worst holders of assets with durations beyond 3 or 4 years. The average bank has a liability duration of close to zero between savings and current accounts and FDs. So all over the world, asset liability duration management is the biggest reason why banks are hesitant to go into long-term debt. Here we have a situation where there is no market, and therefore we are forcing the banks and forcing kind of the NBFCs into long-term debt that are ill-suited to short-duration liability holders. And of course, we have a structural problem. The justice system doesn't work. The transparency and the repeatability of logic and rationality is not good enough. So we have a problem. But in that place, the one long-term asset investor is the life insurance business, is the pension insurance business. These are the natural long-term asset investors in any economy. Here we have this country saying that, on the one hand, we want to sell off LIC. On the other hand, we're going to up the stake in foreign direct investment into insurance from 49 to 74%. So the actions and the philosophy seem contradictory to each other, or at least the words and the philosophy seem contradictory to each other. It is also my concern that we have raised the taxes on oil products, energy products so high that we are assuming, and maybe rightly so, but we are assuming that this $50, $60 range of barrel will continue perpetually, and we have very little room. In the Tamil Nadu Assembly, I spoke 2 years ago when the government raised the VAT. I said it is stupidity, after watching the oil drop from 130 down to 30, to start raising the VAT now. Now you're going to compound into the effect of rising oil prices. It's not going to stay 30 forever. Sure enough, they had to go and cut back, though they didn't cut back the full tax in a year later. This government has become so dependent on petrochemical kind of excise and now cess revenues that were we to see some reason, a supply shock or a price shock in oil, and there's 100 ways it could happen, that's what the market tells you. You cannot imagine what all risks are coming down the pipe. Were that to happen, we'd be in a serious problem of either inflation or complete stop. Now, we can already see there are unintended consequences of this kind of lockdown and global trade shutdown. What was once a glut for the last 5-8 years that I can think of after the 2008 crash, after the commodity boom went flat, there was a glut of containers and shipping capacity. Today, I had my constituents in my office, all kinds of trade associations, who are complaining that there's such a shortage of containers that they are not able to get their goods imported, and they're not even able to get containers to ship their goods from Gujarat and Maharashtra on the west coast down to the southern coast in Tuticorin, because they say road transport is so much more expensive than sea transport. So here we have unintended and unexpected outcomes on the supply side during a crisis. Finally, I'll just make one last point. This government has tried to cover up one sin with another sin. After 2-3 years of trying to do funny money accounting and hiding debt in Food Corporation of India, in other places, borrowing from the NSSF, etc., they have decided this is the year to come clean, and all the press and all their acolytes say, what a great thing, what a great thing. So you used to be a crook, you used to cover this stuff up, now you have made it clear, therefore we give you accolades. First of all, I'm not sure you should be given accolades for stopping doing bad things. But even let's assume that's a good thing. In fact, the reality is that they have done, by Wall Street standards, garden variety accounting shenanigans to show a 9.5% deficit. Because what they've done is taken the accrued debt in Food Corporation of India, in other places, brought it back onto the balance sheet, and therefore tried to cover up one sin with another sin. The original sin is that they claimed they were going to do 10% of GDP as a stimulus. Now, if they had done 10% of GDP as a stimulus, the fiscal deficit should have been somewhere around 15, 17, 18%. Remember that in February, they said it was going to be 3.5%. If they had done nothing more than that, it would have gone to 5 anyway, because the denominator would have gone down and the numerator would have gone up from a lack of revenues, even if they stuck to the old spending plan. So if you then add the 10 on top of that, they should have been somewhere at 15. In fact, they came to 9.5 after doing funny money accounting, because they had to show that having claimed to have done 10% stimulus, and in fact doing 1% as most banks predicted that back on the day of the announcement, then how would they justify that they'd actually done something? So this kind of covering up of all debt and bringing it here to make 9.5 is garden variety accounting fraud. But the two problems with this is, number one, using that as the cover, the government now says that they will not even try to come back to the 3% FRBM limit for the next 5 years, at least as far as this term is concerned. So they've given themselves cover to do whatever failure over the next 3-4 years. If they did it on demand, if they did it on cash transfers, if they did it on spending on the states, I would not have a problem. But they are going to use it to do the wrong things as they have done for the last 5 years is my worry. And finally, it doesn't behoove the finance minister of this country to talk about what color and what kind of container she brings the paper in, or whether it shifts from a paper to a PDF, or whether she reads it from a tablet or a paper. These are all like, gimmicks that are suited not even for a university, let alone for the parliament of a country of our size. And the sin above that, I would say, is for having done all of these accounting shenanigans and barely increased the spending by about 1.5 lakh crores, for the finance minister to stand up in the house and say, we have spent and we have spent and we have spent. Either she doesn't understand the numbers that the team has given her, or she is outright trying to create a false impression using bad data. So in that sense, I would say this notion of a once-in-a-century budget, other than the fact that you have hit records never seen before, I, for one, don't see anything that gives me comfort either as a state representative or as a citizen that tells me that this budget is attuned to the realities we face today, and that because of this action, our future looks any brighter today than it did on January 31st. I think as a MLA and as a Public Accounts Committee member, it is my clear lesson over the last 5 years that the most inefficient spending of all is done by the government. For every rupee that we think we spend, between rent seeking and other inefficiencies and corruption in tenders and whatnot have you, we probably lose 20, 30, 40% depending on the head under which we spend. So I am of the opinion, based on my limited experience, that unless we can clean up the way government functions, unless we can clean up the way the police functions, unless we can clean up the judicial system and make it timely, transparent, and predictable and consistent based on precedent, we are not going to be able to attract investment into the country in general. We are only going to find those cronies that are tight with the government, who are going to be attracting foreign capital. And it is a basic kind of foundation of investment and risk and return in finance, that you don't go into places where you don't have clarity on what are the range of outcomes and what are the variables that you should consider in your risk management or risk assessment exercise. And from that perspective, as long as the government persists in doing destabilizing things for political reasons, we are unlikely to be a kind of attractive source for foreign capital or foreign direct investment. And what does come, as has happened in the last 12 months, the bulk of it goes to one or two individuals or one or two organizations that are seen as somehow quasi-governmental or protected by the government. An old colleague of mine who was an economist at Standard Chartered Bank had a very good way of talking about this. He said, if you take the billionaires in a country, self-made billionaires or within one generation billionaires, and look at the sectors in which they have made their wealth, you can tell the extent to which the economy is kind of clean or rigged, crony. And he says, if you find they've made it in things like software, in kind of competitive manufacturing, then you know that these are global kind of competitive industries, and so they must have done something right. If you find that they have made it in highly regulated industries like telecom, petrochemicals, etc., then you know that it is a crony capital country. And I think though his observation was many years ago, back 5-7 years ago when I was still in the bank, it stands as a good kind of litmus test for me even today. And I think unless we can fix some of these problems, the future doesn't look very bright. But I don't want to be only a pessimist. What I say in my party and to my colleagues and to my leader is that the chances of making substantive change have gone up a lot. As an ex-trader, we say volatility is always our friend, because the worst case scenario is still you get fired or you get paid zero bonus or you don't get re-elected in this case. But the best case is that because everything is a mess or because volatility is high, you could achieve really the kinds of outcomes that you couldn't in a more stable and less volatile world. So I think, of course, there's always hope. And of course, the more complex and the more desperate the situation becomes, the more the opportunity to drive change that has been resistant. Again, my concern is that the government seems to be kind of flailing and using more and more disruption for the sake of disruption of politics rather than constructively for the sake of systemic change. But time will tell us how these things go. That's all. Thank you.